lost continent of Atlantis is the most famous.
Yes.
No, that's there. The world is so well known now. We would know because we know it under the water and above it. If you reflect a small band of hunters in the late Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, many of those people probably met no more than about 35 people in their whole lives. If the mob in Constantinople, Istanbul, or Rome didn't get their free handouts.
For this episode, I interviewed Brian Fagan, archaeologist, author, and Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at UC Santa Barbara. He has written a number of books on archaeology, humans, and most recently climate change. We discussed early humans, the history of hunting, the most influential civilizations, and the effect of localized climate change, which by the way has nothing to do with politics but rather the history of the phenomena. But before we start, I'd like to ask you for a quick favor. Please subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments section, and let's continue growing this community together. Enjoy. There is this well-known illustration of evolution where there is an ape on the left side and it's shown few humanoids and it turns into the modern human. Like, how accurate is that? Did humans really evolve from ape, or we have some common ancestor?
The biggest lesson that we now know about human evolution compared with even 20 years ago is that it was much more complex a process than we had expected. And if you think of human evolution, you don't want to think of ancient apes here and then a line up to modern humans here. What you've got is a kind of tree which went in all sorts of directions, and some of these directions produced hominins who became extinct. More became extinct than survived. And then probably, I'm guessing here, around 100 to 200,000 years ago, the more human-like ones evolved into the direct ancestors of humans whom we know quite a lot about, of whom the most famous, of course, are the Neanderthals of Europe. And these people evolved in all kinds of directions too. But by about 75 to 100,000 years ago, we were effectively the only humans on Earth. The other early humans had all become extinct. So we have a history of being modern humans, which goes back, well, if you really want to stretch it, 300,000 years, but in terms of the full cognitive abilities of humans, 50 to 100. So we're not young, but we are, within that period, become very diverse.
What archaeological evidence do we have that we really relate to those early humans?
The problem with archaeology is that it is the study of physical objects, tools, animal bones, things that survive. Because when you're looking at a very early hominid, like the first one that Dr. Leakey described, you're talking about 2 million years, not 20. And that means that very complex preservation conditions come into play. That's the first thing. The second thing is that a very high proportion of the tools made by the various earliest humans were of perishable materials, bark, wood, bone to some degree, and these do not survive nearly as well as stone, which effectively is permanent. And it is no coincidence that most of what we know about the very early humans comes from their stone tools and from the animal bones which they broke up. And there were some interesting questions here. One of them is, when did humans first begin hunting? Because to hunt is one of our ancient urges, and we've done it for a long, long time. But when we first start, when did we get up in the morning and say, I'm going to kill that antelope over there? The answer is we don't know. It looks very likely that our very earliest ancestors were very good at scavenging. If you had a group of lions killing some antelope, if the antelope lions went away or were chased away, the humans would jump in, grab limb bones and meat, go away and leave the rest to the hyenas and other animals. So scavenging from kills probably was where hunting began. But there were a number of things which are interesting. One is that the very earliest human beings walked on 2 feet. This meant that they could run, that they were relatively fast. And it has been suggested that the first animals that we hunted were smaller antelope, which you could literally run down. Because one of the big problems with hunting is that one has to get really close to them. You're not talking about semi-automatic rifles or guns which fire for 3 miles. You're talking about getting so close to the animal by good stalking that you can go like this and touch it. And literally, many of the early hunters jumped on the backs of animals and killed them by stabbing them through the shoulders. Now, the weapons they had, obviously a very early one was the stone chopper. You make those by chopping jagged edges on pieces of lava and other fine-grained rocks. But the other one is the spear. And the spear is basically a pointed object. And it was sharpened, we know, by flaking wood to sharp points, maybe hardening it in fire, because a very early weapon that hunters had was fire, because they observed natural brush fires, and they would pick up embers and carry them, and eventually they would cook their food, which is a major advance. So you've got a huge reservoir of possible solutions. But for thousands of years, this issue with hunting was very simple. How do you get close enough to an animal to kill it? And you're talking 10 feet, 20 feet. And a great deal of meat must have been scavenged. They obviously took meat when they can get it from recent animal kills. They would get hold of animals that got stuck in swamps or something like that, or they may even build holes so animals went into them. Because one of the interesting things fairly early on is that it was quite a range of different animals that they hunted or ate, including quite large ones. And there really was million years or more of what you would call scavenging stroke hunting. It wasn't really until about 300,000 or 400,000 years ago that you get people really hunting. And we know about this from a fascinating site in a coal quarry in northern Germany called Schöningen. And there they have excavated a series of 3 hunting camps by the side of a lake. And it's clear that they got the bones of the animals and everything. It was clear that these people hunted in groups, and they would kill wild horses, which are not easy to kill. And they must have been much more adept hunters than the earlier people. But what they had was superior communication skills. They were faster on their feet, and their weaponry included spear points of stone, which could be bound and fixed on wooden flags, which gives you much better penetrating power. If you penetrate the skin and the wound, it is less likely to come out, for example. But the range was still a problem. We didn't solve the problem of range, really solve it, until the 19th century, when the rifle came in. I mean, you talk about Napoleonic Wars or the 7 Years' War, the rifles they used there, 100 yards maybe.
What about bows and arrows?
Bows and arrows go back into the late Ice Age. We don't exactly know when. Probably the earliest ones were produced in tropical Africa. But if you look at a bow and arrow, they are basically propelled by a piece of wood and a bowstring. And the range that they could achieve with this was not enormous, maybe 50 feet. But the real issue was the velocity and the accuracy of the weapon. It is known, or we know from just seeing it, that many ancient hunters, and indeed the sand hunter-gatherers of Africa today, are astonishingly skillful with bows and arrows. And they'll fire an animal on the move. They will fire 2 or 3 arrows very accurately in a short period of time, simply because they're carrying the arrows. But the skill required to do this is something you acquire from a very young age. The big revolution in bows came in 3 ways. One was development of the composite bow, which is much more powerful. The second is the ability to hunt with a bow and arrow from the back of a horse. And the people who first did that were the Mongolians, the Mongols, and they were brilliant at it. And then the third one was the crossbow, which is basically an arrow, bow and arrow, which is sort of cranked and you point it. It's heavy and clumsy, but it has superior range and power. But these tools were the basics of hunting right up until round figure, Roman times and later. But make no mistake, some of the bows and arrows they developed were amazing. The longbow, which was used in medieval Europe in battle, was an amazing weapon. That really killed people. So there's the background of hunting for modern humans goes way back.
Yeah, we jumped over maybe a few million years. When you look back at the humanoids that are known to us right now, whom do you personally find the most interesting?
Us modern humans. No, you laugh, but why? A primary purpose of my work is to understand why we're so diverse, how we're different, how we're similar. And the one thing you learn very soon is that modern humans, the last, let's take a round figure, 30,000, 40,000 years, are very different, or very different from the Neanderthals, whose limited communication skills and so on, however good they're hunting. What we have is the ability to think and to plan and to give people our feelings. We do art and all this. And that is where the links of our modern humanity are to be found. The most interesting thing to me is looking at the complex hunter-gatherers and how they worked.
How do we know that Neanderthals couldn't do all that? Like, aside of art, that obviously we probably don't have proof that they were creating art. Like, why do we know that they couldn't think the way we do?
What we have now, compared with even 50 years ago, is an extraordinarily powerful database of scientific research, which, for example, is studying genetics, has become an expert in the anatomy of the brain, and has studied intensively the evolution of speech. And from all these, we're getting a much better profile. They were far more intelligent than we often give them credit for, largely because the very earliest Neanderthals who were discovered were in fact crippled ones, injured ones. So we thought they were all shambling apes. They weren't. They were much more human than we agreed. But today's humans, today's Homo sapiens are Homo sapiens, whether you like it or not. Whether you're a herder in East Africa, a forest dweller in the Amazon, a Pueblo Indian, or a modern European. Ultimately, we're all from the same kind of branch of human evolution, which gives us a lot more similarities than differences.
And all came from Africa.
Ultimately, yes. That the genetics is fairly overwhelming, that Africa was where it began, where the genetic diversity was not large, and then we rapidly spread out. Because the big thing about modern humans is that we developed the ability to adapt to almost any environment on Earth. Unlike Neanderthals, who did. They worked on pretty severe, but they were nothing like us.
How did we spread around the world back then? Because I believe the sea travel only developed later on in human history, right?
We walked. But the interesting thing about it is all hunting was done until the domestication of the horse was pretty well done on foot. And their semblance of distance revolved around changing hunting territories, the availability of game, and so on. And the other thing you have to remember about ancient peoples, and this is true right up until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, is that there were very few of us, and our life expectancy was very short. But if you imagine living in a world where you were likely to only live for an average of 28 years, that was the average age of death in medieval Europe was 28. Why? Disease. And the result was that we tended to spread fairly rapidly because there was no one to stop us. And what really determined where we went was water, game, plant foods, and not initially the presence of other people. If you reflect a small band of hunters in the late Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, many of those people probably met no more than about 35 people in their whole lives. When you think about that and the number of people you meet in the morning, just say commuting or doing whatever you're doing, it's amazing. I mean, I gave a lecture to 400 people. I encountered more people in that 45 minutes than probably in several lifetimes if I had in the Ice Age. And this whole dynamic changes the way we look at it.
And of those 35 people, most of them were your relatives too.
They were indeed. And this is the interesting thing, because one of the ways I think that human populations spread was through kin ties, because one of the most critical things if you're a hunter-gatherer is to know your territory. And if you live in a territory like, say, Central Africa or parts of the Andes, where are you going to get your food? Plant foods, fish, game? You had to know where the very scattered food resources were, which meant that information obtained from people at a distance who knew what was over the next horizon or knew people who was over the next one was critically important. So you really had to rely very heavily on your kin who might live in a village miles away. I worked for a while in the Zambezi Valley in Africa, and I lived among subsistence farmers, and they spent an enormous amount of their time visiting their neighbors who were their relatives. Why? Because if food got short in one village, your kin ties obligated your kin there to feed you, and the same way each way. And this idea of mutual obligation was one of the most powerful forces in the very ancient world. And the movement was entirely on land. I am a sailor. I sailed a lot in my life. And I know that it's practically impossible for people to go offshore in dugout canoes. I mean, they may go, but they'll sink. For example, if you take around here in Santa Barbara, we have a very famous ancient canoe called the Tonwal, which is a planked canoe built by the Chumash Indians, which was a superb boat for the waters around here. But it was a boat which normally went to sea in calm conditions, which we get a lot of the time here. And everything about being successful here, and they fished, was knowing what the environment was above the water and below it. And that's vital, because what you're looking at is knowing your territory, knowing your country, knowing your neighbors. If you look at the Australian Aborigines, who are one of the few surviving people in the world who really do keep up with environmental knowledge, it's staggering what they know. For example, the Aleutian Indians in the Aleut Islands up in the North Pacific have, I believe, something like 12 different individual words to describe the state of waves. Why? Because they spent a lot of their life in canoes, and you needed a very precise definition of what different waves are like, so you knew it was safe to go, or if you were inexperienced, if it was safe to go. These are the sorts of knowledge we've lost, and this is one of the most biggest factors in early history, is this whole business of local knowledge.
Do humans continue evolving? Like, are we the same as the early modern humans, or we're different?
We're basically the same, we're taller. But of course, a lot of this is induced by humanity. We will evolve, I mean, but you have to reflect that any form of evolution, be it a mouse, be it a human, takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't been around that long, but we'll evolve. Which way, I don't know. Then, of course, you get the issue of human interference, humans extending lifespans and so on. Who knows?
Regarding tools, what do you think were the most impactful tools in the history of humankind, going back to modern human? I believe in one of your lectures you mentioned that the needle was very
I was
important.
just about to say the needle is the most unexpected one.
Why is that?
Because a needle allows you to tailor clothing, to make clothing that fits your body form, however different your form is. And this is critically important for people, firstly, who are navigating in canoes in cold water, and B, for people who live in environments like the Arctic, where there are huge changes in temperature. And you get a culture of layered clothing, where you take off layers if it gets warm, put them on if it's not. And that was what the needle gave us, was the ability to sew clothing, to make bedding, to make tents, all kinds of things. That to me was one of the most important things. When did it first come about? No one really knows, but it was in Siberia about 20,000 years ago. That was one very important one. Another very important one was the harpoon. Why? Because if you spear a harpoon in the game, it won't come out. The wound, it'll make the wound worse. That was another important one. Firearms, fire. I mean, you can make a huge list. But I always say the needle, because I want people to focus on the small things. Because it's one thing to make a needle, but to conceive how you can make a shirt, a pair of pants, that's a different ballgame. But who are the most likely to do it? The people in the society who fabricated bedding, who did this and did that, and that is women. And women have a huge gift. My wife, for example, she does quilting, and she's really good.
One of the most confusing things to me is when I watch my wife baking bread, I'm trying to understand how people even came up with it. How did they figure out that they can take wheat, they create flour out of it, they create dough out of flour, and then they bake it? Like, how do we explain that?
Nobody knows, my friend. Nobody knows. You see, there were two types of things that archaeologists study. One is objects, knives, rifles, whatever. The other one is everything that you and I say to each other, which isn't recorded. In the days before recorders, when all information passed from one person to another, from the old to the young, by word of mouth. That raises instant questions. One is, do we say the same things all the time? Do we remember these things? And so on and so forth. The other problem is that a huge amount of knowledge that's passed between us, and this was particularly true of non-literate societies who don't have writing, is how much of it survives and the repetition and the changes. And that's one reason why, for example, Native Americans have always placed a huge emphasis on creation nations. How did we come about? What personalities produced us? And they developed these magnificent legendary tales about animals with magic powers like ravens, the birds, otters, whatever you like. And these tales defined the world they lived in. They really did. They defined codes of conduct and why they were there. And if you look at human society, you have to realize what we've lost if you take the Greek poet Homer, it's one thing for me to say to you, Amos the Ediganaya Fanera Rectalis Heos, which is when rosy-fingered dawn appeared. That's one thing. Or I can say, Amos the Ediganaya Fane, and get you excited. Or I had a teacher in school who did this, where you did it slowly, and you just went to sleep. But what you forget is that this poem wasn't told in a sterile room. It was told by firelight, maybe in a cave, maybe on a battlefield, maybe in a camp, maybe in a timber house. And if the guy was good who did it, and most of them must have been, because they knew this stuff by heart, people remembered. And an awful lot of memory is terribly important. And the world was defined by people who learned everything from memory and from their own experience, which they passed to others. So it's an interesting question. The answer is we know very little. I can give you one example, we do know some. And that is if you look at the cave art in South Africa, which is magnificent. It's pictures of animals with people dancing around them, scenes in camp, blah, 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 blah. Lots of people hunting ostriches, dressed up as ostriches. Beautifully painted, lovely stuff. What is this? Is it art? People just came to the camp and said, hey, I'm going to paint a painting. Or was there a reason? Was it depicting animals so that you acquired their power? Was it a commemoration of history and talking, or what? And a huge amount of research has gone into this, because a lot of people are saying, well, we talked, or our predecessors talked to 19th century people who were artists, and a lot of them had been under hallucinogenic drugs as part of shamanistic rituals. Oh, brother, that's settled for controversy or two, because people don't believe that controlled substances had a role in these societies. Well, I'm sorry, they did. But what this means to us is pure speculation. All you can do is build possible scenarios, which is great fun, but an awful lot of them are garbage.
When were the first civilizations born?
Can you define a civilization for me?
That was my next question for you, actually. How do historians define civilization? Because there is Mesopotamia. That's where I think the first thing I see in history, at least. But maybe I'm missing a lot of stuff.
It's generated enormous debate. There are a number of things which people agree on in general terms. One is that most early pre-industrial civilizations, pre-industrial ones are ones which basically function on human labor, or plows and horses and so on. Most of them are based on cities. But what is a city? Is it a collection of villages? Is it a densely compact place like we have? The civilization generally is based on cities, engages in long-distance trade, has writing. Why? Because if you're administering a very complex society, and these societies traditionally were developed into social classes, nobles, merchants, kings, commoners, slaves, and it was like a pyramid. How do you control this? Well, the answer is you have officials. How do these officials keep records on how many jars of wine were exchanged between one village and the next? The answer, the only way you can do it is with script writing, which is why the Egyptians developed hieroglyphs and why the Mesopotamians developed clay tablets, using whatever material was convenient. And one often forgets that literacy in a pre-industrial civilization is all about power. Because if you have the information and the ability to read it and handle it, you have power. If you don't, you're cut off from a lot of society. And this is very much part of civilization. You could go on ad infinitum. There were dispersed civilizations like the one at Angkor Wat, or the Cambodian one, the Khmer in Southeast Asia. the Indus civilization of India, which was, again, predominantly rural, although it had major urban areas, most of which were connected, one suspects, with trade. Then you have places like Mesopotamia, where early civilizations in the south there were based with city-states. Each one had a state or several states associated with particular gods and goddesses. But around it was a hinterland full of farmers who irrigated the land. And then in Egypt, which is an unusual example because Egypt's a line north to south, and to administer that required being able to sail up and down the Nile, which they did. But again, it's very interesting that every person who lived in a city had a connection, often through relatives, with villages in the countryside from which their distant ancestors had come. Because one of the most important things for farmers and for people living in the pre-industrial world is their relationship with the land where they came from. Because ancestors are the guardians of the land, and you get a lot of these early societies had big ancestor cults for that reason. And the king became the royal ancestor. And a lot of public ceremonies revolved around the fact that this king had to validate it as the royal ancestor, which involved, among other things, this is interesting, a culture, and this is particularly true of Mongolia and around there, where power depended to a considerable extent on the royal hunts. The king or the Khan or whatever he was would develop hunts which were choreographed like operas, where the game was encircled by large numbers of people and then killed in front of an audience. It was a spectacle. Why was it a spectacle? Because I, the king, am powerful, and I'm brave and I'm courageous. So you get that sort of culture. But an awful lot of political power until recently came from hunting and came from military force, and particularly control of food supplies, which, when you got to the Romans, for example, became an increasingly logistically complicated problem because their empire was big and some of their biggest food sources were on the Nile Valley and in North Africa. And they had to transport it all. It's a very complex business. But basically, the pre-industrial civilization functioned on royal power and efficient administration and logistics.
When you think of pre-industrial civilizations, which ones of them you think played the major role in the today's world order?
The ones that are most often quoted, let's put it that way: Rome, Greece particularly Rome, in a very minor way. Egypt is too far away. The Maya are very important to the people in Central America. The Inca, the same thing. The Cambodians take an enormous pride in the Khmer civilization. The Chinese, of course, have these heavily oriented dynastic rules. So if you put all this together, the influence of pre-industrial civilizations on societies, descendant societies, still living in the same general area was enormous. But then when you get into the next stage, which is the imperial empire, Rome, the Inca, the whole dynamic changes because the big thing, Persia, another one, the big problem is how do you control this? And the British Empire in the late 19th, early 20th century ruled over, I think it was a third of the world. How did they do it? They did it by developing a system called indirect rule, where everyone ultimately reported to the king or the queen, and below that were governors and so on. But the administration of this was done with one purpose alone, and that was A, to control the people you ruled, and B, to acquire natural resources for the homeland. And this lasted a remarkably long time.
If you ask regular Joe like me who didn't study history and archaeology.
Wouldn't call you a regular Joe, but I'll take it.
Yeah, like I could say a few words about Roman Empire and maybe Roman civilization or Greek or maybe a little bit of Chinese, but I know almost nothing about Inca civilization. What was interesting about Incas?
The Inca are fascinating because of where they are. They are based in the Andes, and they developed an enormous empire which extended from the southern Andes, which are high, very high, down to the lowlands, along the coast of Peru, which is one of the driest environments on Earth, and right up into Ecuador, an enormous area of remarkably diverse peoples. How did they rule it? They ruled it by micromanagement. They divided it up into provinces. Each provincial ruler had a very close relationship with the supreme ruler, the Inca. Thin ties linked everybody, and they built an elaborate road system, which was startlingly efficient, given that it was run by llamas and other beasts. And they also were very skillful, ruthless warriors. If you put all that together with a very well-defined ideology, for example, if you look at the Egyptian pharaohs, you're talking about people who worshipped the sun god Amun for centuries, well established. And the Inca ruler was Viracocha, was the supreme ruler. And this lasted very well because they were very efficient. But in the end, and everything depended on a smooth succession from one Inca ruler to the next. And this was governed very largely by the personality of the supreme ruler and the amount of time he took preparing for his death. In other words, succession. And if you look at, say, ancient Egyptian civilization or the Maya court or the Inca court, it was constant maneuvering to make sure that you're in a good position. If the leader dropped dead of a heart attack, and they did, some of them, their life expectancy in their 20s was a pretty pressure-ridden environment to live in. And one of the problems the Inca didn't have for quite a while was succession. But when they did, which oddly enough was just when the Spaniards arrived, they were gone. It's a very artificial construction, and a huge amount of it depends on who's loyal to whom. It is amazing what they did.
Do we know of any lost civilizations where there is some traces of it? No, we don't. Okay.
That is an old 19th century thing. The lost continent of Atlantis is the most famous.
Yes.
No, that's there. The world is so well known now. We even know because we know it under the water and above it. No way. There are people writing books on it who make a lot of money doing it, but they're writing absolute horse manure.
So in 20 seconds, you basically killed this whole hope for Atlantis.
Yes. No, there is an enormous following among people who believe that North America was colonized by the Romans or that ancient astronauts landed in Peru. And these people believe in this stuff almost like religion, like a religion. And you can't argue with these people. They believe this is so, and then you're challenging their faith. And that, as you know, is very difficult. It's these aren't ideologies, they're faiths. There's a difference. And I personally get asked about this. I just do what I said to you. It's nonsense. It is. What archaeology does, and other people, is we produce adventure stories. There's our heroes, there are villains, there are epic voyages, there are victories, whatever. But they're based on what we know from the data. And the trouble for a lot of these people is that the data coming out on archaeology now is so good and so detailed that it's very difficult to challenge it with any of their ideas. The latest thing is to say, oh, well, of course, the lost civilizations are lost below the Antarctic ice. Hello, I mean, really, it's absurd. And all one can do is ignore it. It's like certain political beliefs you hear around here in this country. If you believe it, there's nothing I can do to change your mind.
I'm pretty sure you agree that we're probably the most advanced civilization that existed on Earth, right? There is nothing, not Romans, no one, neither Roman, nor Greek or Egyptian.
Came over here? No. That what some plants floated over. That's true. There has been recent debate as to whether the Polynesians came over from the Pacific Islands to South America. But again, I don't think so. To prove that, you would have to have data that showed that hundreds of people had landed and stayed here. That we don't have.
When you look back on these civilizations, what was the theme of why they disappeared, why they fell?
An enormous array of reasons. If you take the Egyptians, they got defeated by the Romans and absorbed into the Roman Empire for one very good reason. Egypt had grain, food. The Maya lived in city-states and were so volatile politically, it was very difficult for anyone to rule for any length of time. And they fell in front of the Catholic Church and the Spaniards. If you look at the Indians of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, who were remarkable people, they scattered from their home gorge in the face of drought within several generations. They didn't get up one morning and say, "Good morning, we're leaving." They gradually, family by family, just evaporated. If you look at the Romans, you've got a very interesting case. There are, I believe, something like 260 different theories as to why the Roman Empire collapsed. All I can tell you is, well, I think there were a number of factors involved. One was plague, but that I know nothing about. But another piece is a piece of reality. If you take Rome and in later Roman Empire, Constantinople, the harsh reality was that to feed their urban poor and their armies, they had to have grain because the Roman Empire, like Egypt, operated off grain rations. And if the mob in Constantinople, Istanbul, or Rome didn't get their free handouts, they were in trouble. So Egypt was enormously important. So was North Africa. But Egypt, its climate is influenced very strongly by El Nino activity in the Southwest Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And if you get a strong El Nino, you don't get the big Nile floods. And what happens? The Nile dries up and crops fail. And in the middle of one of the most critical periods of Roman history at the end, they had a series of droughts in Egypt, which really had an impact because nearly all Egypt's grain was shipped to Constantinople. And then you add the North African grain to that, you really got a problem. And a lot of these societies were extremely vulnerable to, political disorder if food was short. Because the teaching was that the pharaoh or the emperor was all powerful, developed the infrastructure to feed people. For example, one of the myths of Egyptian civilization is that every June the flood would come, it would flood the floodplain of the Nile, and then the water would go back, and they planted in the damp soil. Fine. But the Nile does not flood every year. And in 2100 BC, they had a century when the floods were poor, and ancient Egypt as a state fell apart. This is not very well known, but it did happen. And you've got things like that going on. And multiply that for the Roman Empire, and you have a problem.
You wrote a book about this, right? Climate chaos.
I have written a series of books on climate change. starting with a book on El Nino, which really apparently at the time caused quite a stir. And the latest one, which I wrote with a co-author friend of mine in England, is a book called Climate Chaos, which really is a book which updates what I wrote 10 years before and is really an attempt to sort of look at some of the strategies which we have to look at. Not in any way saying, oh, we're going to all die in a giant Armageddon. That's been said to death. What I wanted to do is to say, look, here's the past. What have we learned from the past for today and the future? And one thing we've learned from it is that, well, we knew it, but the more thing is that climate is local, climate change. If you take, for example, the recent rain in California, which was quite memorable,
Yeah.
that needs very careful local remedial action. If you look at the dangers of rising sea levels in the Bay Area, you still have a local problem, but the ripplings economically are enormous. And an awful lot of what's been said about flooding and coastal flooding forgets the fact that rising sea levels are a major potential villain. But they're not necessarily a villain in your lifetime or mine, but in our grandchildren and great-children's time, it's going to be a huge problem. Imagine sea levels 10 foot higher and a Category 6 hurricane in southern Florida with the Durbin density there. Are you going to be able to evacuate 1 million people in a week? No. Look at Hurricane Katrina or some of the other ones in the south. Same thing applies. So an awful lot of what you do locally is important. And the other thing is that we have to realize that climate change is here. And one of the things we pointed out is how important kinship is. Another thing we pointed out that if you live in a city, the close ties of, say, churches or Rotary clubs are terribly important in developing community in societies that are basically very, very anonymous. And the other most important thing we do, which is the hardest of all, is to develop political systems and policies which look not at today or tomorrow, but look to our great grandchildren's times. Because if we do things now, it will be cheaper and easier and with much less human suffering than then. The problem is to persuade any politician to look further than the next election. And one laughs, but it actually isn't funny because we really have problems. And it's very refreshing that some parts of Europe, notably the Netherlands, are looking way ahead on this with good results. So there's a lot to think about. We aren't thinking about this, and we should be.
From the perspective of localized climate change, but historically, it was more lethal because there was no communication with the outside world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like now it's a little bit more mitigated, right? We're not as, it's not as, I don't know, say lethal, but not as scary as it used to be historically. Do you see some major climate changes in that can affect the humanity? Is it what you just suggest, just a sea level rise? Is it what you think?
There are all kinds of ones which are very frightening, because the big difference between now, which is I didn't mention, between now and ancient climate change is an awful lot of climate change is not just local. And one of the things we have to develop, and the irony is we have the communication technology and everything all there, is to make, for the sake of argument, Cambodia and Peru realize they have common problems. This is beginning to happen, but there are huge problems out there, of which the warming oceans is one. Another one is the whole area of drought and rainfall, because one of the biggest things we learned from the climate change study was that in the final analysis, probably the most destructive factor for humans is drought, because it's slow moving and it's totally unpredictable. There's no way of predicting drought. And this to me is the biggest problem.
Even now.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Why? Because how do you get water to a desert? Do you transport it by pipeline, or do you desalinize? But then you've got the energy cost of doing it, which is huge. There are no easy solutions to this. It's like the whole rainforest thing. That's another one, which is really major. So, there were no easy solutions. The great thing is that people generally are getting somewhat more conscious of the importance of all this. And that's very encouraging.
So if history is guide, where do you see human race going from here?
Where it's got to go, shall we say? Not we'd like it to go. It's got to go. It's got to become, we've really got to become an international humanity. We've got to get rid of a lot of these ethnic disputes about nationalism and about boundaries. That doesn't mean to say that we don't have cultural differences which we respect and admire, like artistic ones. But we've really got to start looking at the future of humanity globally. And one of the things that is most pressing is the whole area of climatic refugees. And that's one that we haven't done anything about really yet. That's going to be major in the next 30 years.
That's a very interesting point, because I was thinking about it from I'm an immigrant, obviously.
So am I.
Yeah, so there are refugees, and people here in the United States tend to be very protective against refugees, right? Historically, when humans couldn't have food in the particular area where they were born, they would just move. The idea of patriotism and boundaries, it wasn't as strong as it is now, right?
It's a product of the 19th century and earlier. Really, it started with back with the early empires. But yeah, no, it's terribly. We've got to break this down, because you can't be afraid of immigrants. Many of them have a great deal to give. But we live in this society where, I hate to say this, a lot of us still want to live in the 1940s and 50s, where everything was run by the minority of people. I'm sorry, the world has changed, and the world is not necessarily better for them having had that power either. I find it extraordinary that we have this nostalgia for this, because we can create an incredibly vibrant, multicultural society here. And one day they will, but the suffering will be enormous.
Do you think it's going to be this multicultural society, or at some point humanity will just destroy itself?
No, I have no illusions. It's going to be very difficult. It will be violent, but what is going to develop are societies where people marry people of different skin colors, completely different ancestries, because they like each other and find things in common. And one of the most interesting things about being a professor has been to watch how the university community has changed. It's now infinitely more multicultural and much more happy in many ways. The problem is you've always got a few people who will stir it up because they have an agenda. What people have got to realize is that these small-scale agendas aren't relevant. But then someone will violently disagree with me and say, what about anti-Semitism, or what about this, what about that? That isn't the way the world's working anymore. The most striking thing to me is how many people aren't aware how much the world has changed, and it's changing. And it's changing for the better, in my judgment. That an awful lot of the ways we behave in the face of threats is really 1850 sort of stuff. It's not today. I'm an archeologist. I should be spending my life looking back. But what it has taught me to do is to look forward, always.
When you look forward, do you see the potential for humanity to destroy itself?
No. After all these years, I'm a huge believer in Homo sapiens. I think we're smart enough to figure out solutions. They may not be pleasant ones. A lot of people will die, but we will survive. Why? Because in the final analysis, we have strong instincts of self-preservation. I won't be allowed to see it, but that's my optimism.